you. Good morning slash afternoon slash wherever you may be. Hello, I'll just keep it as simple as that. And welcome to Taking Jamstack all the way to 11, an introduction to Eleventy. And I promise there won't be too many puns on the word 11. That should be it, as far as I know anyway. So hi, everyone. My name is Raymond Camden. I am a developer evangelist at Adobe. I actually work on the document services team, working with some really cool APIs that work with PDFs and other documents. I'm not talking about my day job at all here, but in like 2 hours or 2 slots from this one, my coworkers Ben and Alicia, who I bet a lot of y'all know, are actually going to be talking about what I do for my 9 to 5. So I absolutely encourage you to stick around and attend that session as well. I'll be in the chat trying to help with questions. I blog at Raymond Camden. If you know me from the Cold Fusion world, I've been blogging for a long time, probably too long. I should probably stop at some point. But if you have any questions about what I'm talking about today, you could definitely reach out to me there. My blog is actually built on what I am talking about today. So if you want to see a large scale example of Eleventy, my blog is a great example of that, I think. I tweet at Raymond Camden. It's definitely a strong mix of technical and non-technical, personal, food / political / etc. It's me. But you don't have to care about that. If you also have a question, my DMs are open, and I really, really like questions. Part of my history of blogging has come from people asking me questions. So I don't mind you asking. If you ask me a question that's not good, I will let you know. I'll tell you I can't answer that, but definitely reach out to me. If you want to talk about anything I'm talking about today, or Cold Fusion, or Jamstack, or Vue, or cats, or adoption, or anything at all, reach out. Finally, this particular slide deck and the demos are all up on GitHub. And so you can grab a copy of that and play with the examples yourself. So we are going to be talking about Eleventy, a product that I absolutely love, even though the name is sometimes a bit hard to type and a bit hard to Google. You'll also see it spelled 11ty. And this is going to be yet another SSG. So what is that? So there are a couple prereqs for this talk. Some things that I hope that you already know. First of all, is what the heck is the Jamstack? If you've never heard of the Jamstack, that could absolutely be its whole session by itself, but it is a way to use a dynamic app server locally and a simpler static site in production. So what do I mean by that? For a long time, I did everything in Cold Fusion. So I had an application server running in production, had a database server running in production. You would hit my blog and you would hit the homepage, and Cold Fusion would talk to SQL Server, get my last 10 blog posts, dynamically create that output, and show it on screen. If you click to view a particular post, I essentially had one template that would look at the URL parameters and say, oh, they want this particular post. So hit the database, fetch that information, and show it on screen. Essentially, the application server was always running and the database server was always running. One of the things that I found out pretty quickly, or at least more recently, is that there were a lot of times where Cold Fusion and even Node.js was just more power than I needed. I had sites where they were dynamic, they were talking to a database, but that database was changing maybe once a month. So what made Jamstack so compelling to me is that on my local machine, I could still talk to a database. I could still use templates like I was using in Cold Fusion and Node.js. I could have all that locally and essentially push a button and go into production with basically just simple flat files. This was done typically with a SSG, or a static site generator, essentially a way to generate a static site. And what was compelling to me is that in production, I went from having a web server, a application server, a database server, to just having a web server. I had less things that could go wrong. I had less things to worry about keeping securely patched and stuff like that. I had something simple, and I like simple. The more powerful my tools are, when there is a simpler option, I will always go to it. Now, one of the things you may ask is that, hey, if I give up Cold Fusion or PHP or Node.js, how do I do dynamic stuff, like even just a contact form? Well, typically in the Jamstack, what you'll use is JavaScript to talk to an API. That could be some other service, for example, to send mail, or it could be a serverless function. So it's a static website, but it's enhanced with JavaScript and APIs to add the dynamic aspects back. You can find out a lot more at jamstack.org. And keep in mind, as much as I've been a huge proponent of the Jamstack over the last couple of years, it's absolutely not a solution for everything. I'm not saying to stop using Cold Fusion, stop using PHP, stop using Node.js. But for me, I found a lot of cases where the Jamstack just worked a heck of a lot easier for me. So Eleventy is a JavaScript-based tool, and this was really enticing for me. One of the biggest known Jamstack tools is Hugo, and that's built on Go. And there's nothing wrong with Go, but I don't know Go. Another really popular one, and one I used for a little while, is called Jekyll. Jekyll is based on Ruby, another language that I don't know. And one that is a bit problematic when you try to install it. And that's not a reflection on Ruby. It's maybe a reflection on me and my patience in terms of doing dependencies and various things like that. Node.js and JavaScript pretty much works everywhere. It's also very flexible. I mentioned a couple other different tools out there. Some are very prescriptive in terms of they really want you to do something a certain way. Eleventy pretty much says, you know what, whatever the heck you want to do, I'm going to let you do it. Some people like that. Some people don't like that. I really, really like that. The tool I used in the past, I won't say its name, even though I said earlier, it's very popular, it's very fast, but it was very hard to do the kind of weird custom things that I like to do. Now it is fast, and I say fast-ish. It is not the fastest generator out there. Hugo right now is probably the fastest. When I had my site with Hugo, and I have around 6,600 blog posts, so not a small site, but Hugo was processing that entire set of data, and I want to say like 30 seconds or so. Extremely quick. Eleventy, until a recent update, was somewhat slower, 15 minutes. But I could set it up so that locally, when I was testing and writing new content and modifying the layout, it was very easy to tell Eleventy, hey, just look at my last 2 years of content. And that made it a heck of a lot quicker. It was only 15 minutes when I would do a new blog post and it would update in production. Luckily, the hosting service that I was using did not bring my site down. It would build a new site, and when it was launched, it would just copy it over. So I didn't care about the 15 minutes, except for when I would have like a dumb typo, which I have done from time to time. I can say Eleventy has gotten much quicker very recently. I want to say on average now, I do a change to my blog, a new post, even a new like a change to my header or footer or whatever, and it's about 3 minutes. And for someone else hosting my system and me not worrying about it, I'm totally fine waiting 3 minutes for a new blog post to show up. Nothing I write is that crucial where it needs to be immediate. So some basic information about Eleventy. So the website is 11ty.dev. I, again, suck at typing that and remembering it, so I just have it bookmarked. As of right now, it is December 8th, 2021. It is on version 0.12.1. 1.0 is very, very, very soon. In fact, I'm using 1.0 for my blog. Any kind of testing I do will be 1.0. They do something that I don't care for. In their documentation, they have the 1.0 stuff intermixed with everything else. Now they mark it like, hey, this is just for 1.0. But wearing my developer relations hat, I know for a fact I've missed that notice multiple times. I kind of wish they would kind of flag it a bit more that, this is 1.0, this is not released in mainline. So just going to keep that in mind when you look at the documentation. Also know that 1.0 is, I think, beta 8 or so. I had been running it for about 2 months of production. It feels stable. So I would say if you feel comfortable using 1.0 and using a not released version, then just go ahead and do so. If you don't, then just kind of keep in mind when you look at those docs to pay attention for when it flags something as 1.0 only. It has a online repository, of course, and it's on Twitter at Eleventy. One thing I'll point out about the GitHub repository, and I'll open this up real quick. I'm only seeing this kind of recently, but GitHub actually supports support forums under the discussions tabs. So if you've ever wished on a repository that you had a place to ask a question, not report a bug, not request a new issue, GitHub does support that. I don't see a lot of repositories making use of it, but Eleventy does. It's pretty active, and it is a good place to ask questions. In fact, you can see I have a question that I have answered here already, or partially answered anyway. But yeah, so check that out for support. Installing, pretty much like everything else that works with Node.js. Eleventy itself is scoped under @11ty, so make sure you don't forget that. In fact, I think if you install it without that other package spits out a warning that, hey, if you're looking for the SSG, this is the wrong thing. This will install the command line globally. If you want to do 1.0, it is tagged as beta. So add @11/11 at beta, and I'll give you the 1.0. And you could also install it locally by just using package.json. So here I've done say dev. I asked for the current release version, and I'm running it via npx. You can use any combination of those, or whatever kind of makes sense for you. The CLI, it will be called Eleventy, surprise, surprise. If you run it in a directory, it will essentially just do it. It'll convert that site to a static site. If you do Eleventy-serve, it will do the same thing. I'll put it into a folder, but it'll also fire up a web server that allows you to see what you're working on. It will also support hot reload. There's a small caveat on how that works, and I'll talk about that caveat in a bit. But you can just start typing away and it'll reload. The only thing I'll say to watch out for is that if you do something really bad and like break the server, the command line will crash, and you'll have to notice that and start it up again. But I only crash my server like once an hour or so. There are lots of flags that you can pass. So as one simple example, when you run Eleventy, it outputs to a folder called _site, and it looks in the current folder for its input. Both the input and the output directories can be configured via command line flag, so you can change it to do whatever you want. So I'm going to show an example of that. And by the way, y'all let me know if this text is too small. I will go ahead and make it bigger anyway, like so. All right. So I have a directory. It's got one file in it, a markdown file. I'll open up Visual Studio Code real quick. And this is my markdown. Hello world. This is Ray. And I apologize. I have one of those mechanical keyboards that sounds like I'm like breaking metal. I will try to keep the typing to a minimum. So there we go. This is Ray, and this is a second paragraph. All right. If you've never seen Markdown, it is a way of building HTML with a lot of shortcuts. So for example, that pound means H2, and the white space in between everything will create paragraphs. So if I run 11, it's going to run super fast because it's one file. But the command line will tell me what it did. It's writing to _site based on one particular file, index.md. And it told me what it did, and it told me how fast it did it, 0.7 seconds. By the way, if I have time at the end, I'll run it on my blog, and you can see how long it takes. If we were to look at _site, we get an HTML file. So great, it literally just translated Markdown to HTML. If I want to get a bit more fancy, I will do 11-serve. And this is going to fire up a local web server at localhost 8080. And control-click, open up, please. There we go. And I can see my Markdown converted to HTML. And if I go in here and go back to my Markdown, see, I'm really excited about saying hello world. I go back. Hot reload is not going to work. And the reason that it's not going to work is that the hot reload library it's using requires a full HTML document. And by that, I mean an HTML tag, a header tag, a body tag. I don't have that now. I just did some simple Markdown. It's got a header and 2 paragraphs, but I can handle going over here and clicking and seeing the update. Now, once you have like a quote unquote real site going on with real layout and stuff like that, you will get the automatic reload, and you won't have to worry about the trauma of hitting the reload button yourself. All right, so that's the command line, and really it is that simple. Like I was saying, there's a lot of flags where everyone can figure, what input directory it wants to look at and where it wants to output stuff. You could do that. You could do things like changing the port. I rarely change that. The only flag I tend to use a lot is the quiet flag, because you can imagine, you saw the command line output, what it was doing for each file. I've got 6,000 plus files in my blog. I don't want all of those reams of output coming to screen, even when I'm working locally, and I ignore like most of my blog's history and work with only like 100 blog entries. That's still a lot of content. So I typically tell the CLI to hush up a little bit. So let's actually start to kind of build this out and make it a little bit more complex. When you start building pages, you will begin by picking a template language. So when you work with Cold Fusion has a template language, that's CFML. PHP has its own thing as well. Those are different template languages. In client-side JavaScript, we have a couple of options for that as well. And 11 is going to let you use them for your local pages. I will create a file, let's say /foo.md, and then 11 will manage that particular output. And what it does is it looks for a friendly URL version. So by taking /foo.markdown and outputting to /foo/index.html, I can create a link to just foo and not worry about the extension, and then it's going to work for me. Now, you do have control over that entire thing. So for example, I use 11 to output JSON files. I use 11 to output my RSS XML file. And what I do is I essentially use 11's control to say, hey, I know you have a default for this file name. I want you to use, site.xml or feed.xml instead. In terms of the template languages, and again, these are the things that you would use to build pages. You can use HTML. I mean, just writing HTML and it comes out as is. You can use Markdown, as I've just shown you. You can use JavaScript. You can use Liquid. Liquid is my favorite. Liquid is what Jekyll used, and it's the one, it's like my default template language to use. Nunchucks comes from Mozilla. Oh, I went a bit too fast there. Nunchucks, just there you go, is an option. Handlebars is one I've used in the past as well. Handlebars I find is a bit strict in terms of how you use it, so it's not my favorite. There's Mustache, there's EJS. I don't like EJS because it's super ugly, But EJS is incredibly flexible. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. There's Haml, there's Pug. If you don't know what Pug is, Pug used to be called Jade, and they got hit by a copyright thing and they had to change. And custom. 11e 1.0 actually allows you to add your own template language to the library and then make use of that in your sites. But there's even more. I talked about how flexible 11e is, and I can't stress just how flexible it is. Because you even get things like when you use Markdown, you can still use Liquid inside your Markdown. So for some reason, I needed to do like a looping construct. I can do that within my Markdown file without having to switch completely to Liquid. The fact that Markdown uses Liquid as well, that is a configuration thing. So if you prefer Handlebars, you could tell 11e, say, hey, when you parse Markdown, I also want you to use Handlebars with it. You can also mix this up. So within my site, my blog, because I prefer Liquid, all of my content is in Markdown because it's nice and simple. All of my like application pages and stuff, that is mostly Liquid. But I could drop an EJS file in there as well. And that's what I did to build my custom stats page. And I will, this stats page is just for me, basically. I don't think anybody else cares about it. But because I was doing like a lot of mathematics stuff, I wanted to see my cadence over the last 2 months, for example. Thank you, Thanksgiving and other holidays, and also see my stats per year. By the way, I still can't believe I wrote 800 blog posts in 2007. That was pre-Twitter, so that explains a lot of it. But this particular stats page would have been difficult to do in Liquid, so I just switched to EJS, and it wasn't a problem. 11e was cool about that. Now, in general, you should, you and your team should pick one language and stick to it. But I love that 11e is like, hey, if you just, switch something out, I'm cool with that. You go ahead and do it. And in fact, and this is what I just talked about, in 11e 1.0, in one file, you can actually mix stuff up. This is really powerful. I've been meaning to do a blog post on it, but you can literally have a block of code that's just EJS and then the rest be Liquid. Again, I'm not necessarily sure how often you're going to do that, but you can. So as an example of that, I'm going to go back to the site that I'm building in this little trash folder. I have an index.markdown file. I'm just going to add a ray.liquid. If you've never seen Liquid before, that's okay. I'll write some pure HTML. I'm going to assign a variable, assign name equals Ray. And that's a variable assignment in Liquid. I rarely do this. I will just work with existing data, but I haven't showed you how to use data yet. So I'm going to do this instead. And what I will do is I'll say hello name. So that is about the simplest Liquid example I can think of. I'll go back to my command line. I'm still running it. I forgot I was still running it, but it's there. And you can see it took ray.liquid and it wrote it to /ray/index.html. I go back to my browser and manually type in /ray. I'll end up at my Liquid page. And what I can do, just to make this more complex, I will say, here's a link to Ray, like that. Go back, reload, and just to make sure it works, and it does. And I will modify my name real quick. I'm not Ray, I'm Raymundo. Save it, come back, and there we go. But just to be clear, when we look at the output and underscore site, it's just HTML. So I have a semi-dynamic website. It's not dynamic because I assign one value to that particular variable, but it's dynamic enough locally And the underscore site is what would be in production. It's what the end user would actually see when I go live. And by the way, you see me glancing right and left. I have one chat on the right, one chat on the left, and I'm trying to make sure that I am following along and not missing anything. So I apologize if I seem a bit more, crazy than normal. All right, so you've seen simple pages. Now we're going to kick it up a bit more and talk about layouts and includes. So when we talk about a layout, we're essentially talking about a way to abstract the header, the footer, the way that your site pages look into another page. Again, if you're a Cold Fusion developer, you've been doing this since about Cold Fusion 3 or so when they added custom tags, or Cold Fusion 4. You basically say, hey, here's my header, here's my footer, put a particular page on the inside, and that is a layout. Eleventy supports that. And include works the same way as in Cold Fusion, essentially saying, take content from another file and suck it in and drop it into my page. This will be defined in front matter, and I will show you what front matter means in a second. And by default, everything will look in a folder called underscore includes, which again, you can configure if you care to. This also can be changed. So what I mean by that is typically a blog will have a layout that applies everywhere. Your homepage, your About You page, your contact page, and your blog post. But every blog post will have a similar layout. So we'll always have the post title on top and a post footer at the bottom. So with layout chaining, I could basically say, I'm writing a blog post. It's going to use a layout called the post layout. The post layout is going to do its stuff. Then it's going to say, hey, I want to use the main layout, and then chain to that. Eleventy supports that as deeply complex as you want to go. So front matter is a pretty standard thing for static site generators, pretty standard amongst the Jamstack. It is stuff in front of your page or on top of your page. There's almost always a delimiter of some sort. In this example, you can see dash, 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 and then my front matter, and then dash, dash, dash. And it's almost always going to be key value pairs, normally written in YAML. YAML is an incredibly fun format. It's as fun as going to the dentist. That's how much fun it is. Yeah, it's easy, but it's also a bit nitpicky. Be sure you don't ever include tabs in YAML because that will break it. But as long as you keep it simple, like you see here, then you're going to be just fine. I've defined 3 values here: layout, title, and another. And then I've assigned the values, some name, something, and thing. So this basically is data for my file, this particular file. It could be a blog post or something like that. In Eleventy, when I define a front matter value for layout, Eleventy will recognize that. And I'll say, hey, I'm going to look for a file in that underscore includes folder called some name. And then I'm going to take that, I'm going to put the content from this page, and I'm going to stuff it inside the contents of the layout template. So this will make a bit more sense if we actually build this out. So I'm going to go in trash. I'm going to make a new folder. I'm going to call it includes. And I am going to make a file for my layout called main. I'm going to call it main.liquid. Give it a default title. 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to give it a full HTML experience. I have HTML tags, I have a head, I have a body, like so forth, and I will even style it a bit. This is the most typing I'll do, I promise. I'll move a bit closer, so hopefully it's over the sound of the clack, clack, clack. But we'll do a background color. And by the way, I could use an external CSS file, but I'm trying to keep it simple. And all I got to do to include my contents is to add a variable called contents. So now if I go into my markdown file and say, hey, you know what, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, title, homepage, layout, main, I'll save it. And I will copy this front matter for array.liquid. And this will be the array page. And then I'm going to restart just to make sure it picks up that change. And go back, and I should see that I messed up. I always forget the darn name of the thing. Content, singular. All right, of course it is. It's content, not contents. Now when I go back, and also note that I didn't have to reload, it just happened. If I go back to my layout and add some margins to my body of 50px, save it, I'll tab back, it's already happened. So I mentioned before that for that hot reload to work, I needed to have the full HTML, and there it is. So that's layouts, and again, you can make that a lot more nicer than what I did. Eleventy also has a way to organize your content. Basically, it's taking your files and just making them static, but it also has a way to group your content. So imagine that your site has blog posts and press releases and documentation. Eleventy says, I'm going to give you a way to define, like, where are all my blog posts, where are all my press releases, and it'll also give you code access then to work with them, which is really handy. It calls this collections, and like I said, it's a way to group files. It is going to be tag-based, where the tags will be defined in your front matter, but you can also define them dynamically. So for example, you could say this entire folder will be my blog post. So the way this looks in front matter is that when Eleventy sees tags and then some value, everything that shares the same value, so in this case post, becomes a collection. Inside your code, and this is a liquid example, it would look a little different in Nunchucks versus Jade, etc. But I can work with collections.post, and then I could just loop over it, and I get access to everything in there. So when I have that, I can do things like showing the last 5 blog posts, or the first 10 blog posts, etc. Basically, I can work with any type of content that makes sense for my site. So as an example, and I won't be typing as much, if we look at demos collections, and you know what, let me run this real quick, and that way you can see the output, and I'll show the code. Demo collections, 11D serve. All right, go back to the page and reload. Here I have a very simple blog. It has 2 blog posts, alpha and beta. That's alpha and that's beta. But the way that I generated this is like so. I have a folder called post, and there I have 2 markdown files. That's how I'm writing my blog post. Each of these shares the same tags, tags post. Because they share that same value, in my other templates, I can loop over collections.post. And in this case, I'm not doing any sorting or limiting. I'm just listing them out. But I can link to their URL. This is a value that Eleventy knows and provides for me automatically. Data refers to the data within my markdown file, and they have titles. And if I go in here and write gamma.md, and I'm just going to copy and paste from alpha and say gamma, it still has the same toast. Returning to Cold Fusion. You heard it here first. Save it, go back, and gamma showed up automatically. I didn't have to worry about that. And I go in there and I see my post. So this is a pretty powerful thing. Again, you don't necessarily have to use the front matter. You can use different types of code. One example would be a glob. So, looking at a particular folder for a particular file format type, you could build it by hand. You have multiple different ways of doing it. In fact, you could talk to a database and get those records and then create a collection from that your templates could then make use of. So one thing I want to point out is that that blog wasn't showing any dates. It wasn't doing any sorting. Almost always you'll have to do some type of date information for your site. It's very critical a lot of times. You can and typically should define a date in your front matter. Eleventy does provide a date based on file creation. You probably don't want to use that, especially if you're using some type of continuous integration service where you commit to GitHub and then you build your site. That file creation date may not match, like the day that you wrote the markdown file. Dates should be an invalid YAML date spec. It's not that hard, but you're welcome to read it if you want to. And essentially it looks like year-month-day. You can include times as well. Eleventy supports 2 special values, last modified and created. But again, I would not recommend using this. And you can actually include your date in your file path. So I know I keep saying this. Eleventy is like stupidly configurable in terms of just how flexible it is. So if you don't want to include a date in your front matter, you can include it in your folder or your file name. So as an example of this, and again, I'll kill this one and go into demo date. Oops, dates. 11 serve. I'll run it and then show you the code. All right, let's go back to the home page. So this is my blog again. I have beta and alpha, one written January 24th, one written Jan 14th. By the way, it's a very long date format. I'll explain how to do that better later. But where those dates came in, go into demo dates, look at my post. You can see I provide a date for both of those. And again, if I wanted to, I could provide a time. And by default, Eleventy will sort by the earliest date first. For a blog, you almost always want that reversed and want the second one last. And I see David Schaller asked a question about my last thing about collections. Is based on the tag, not the folder name. David, you're right, it's based on the tags. I can create a custom collection based on a folder name instead. It's really what you want to do. Eleventy provides that flexibility. And if I have time later, or not, I can show you an example of that. Reach out to me if you would like. But that is dates. And again, fairly simple to use and pretty common for most of your sites. Sorry, got a little brain fart there. So let's talk about another Eleventy feature called data. So this is information for your site. This includes things like page data. So you saw me use a page title a couple of times. That's part of a page's data. So is its date. The date of the blog post is part of its data. Directories could have data associated with them. You can also have data for an entire site, which Eleventy calls global data. Global data is the one that's probably the most interesting. It's stored in a folder called _data. The name of the file represents the name of the variable. So if I have a file called foo.something, my liquid templates, etc., could make use of a variable called foo. JavaScript files can be either synchronous or asynchronous, and I'll show you an example of that. And you can even define this in the configuration stuff that I haven't shown yet. But instead, let's look at the example. And as with before, I'm going to show you a running example and then show you the code behind it. And it's thinking, uh-oh, could we have a demo failure? It's thinking. Was good because I do want to show you what happens when something goes wrong with Eleventy, and I probably put a bug in my code on purpose just to show you what happens when that happens, when that does happen. Sweet. Okay, that's not a bug, but I want to pause on explaining why it took so long until I show you the output. So this is the site. And it says it's my site. I have a list of cats, which have a name, age, and a gender. I have a list of Star Wars films. You may have heard of Star Wars? And then where did all this come from? If we look at the code, I have a underscore folder called data. And I'm gonna look at index.liquid. And one of the first things I do is output site.name. Well, I have a site.json file that has a couple of things like the site name, author, email. In Cold Fusion, this would be like application variables, things that I'm going to use everywhere. Go back to the index.liquid. You saw that I enumerated over a list of cats and showed their name, age, and gender. This comes from another JSON file, cats.json. And if I switch this, if I edit up cat's name, it's going to update. The last thing was film. Now, notice the film code is almost the exact same as the cat code. The difference is that films is actually using JavaScript. It's making a network request, it's getting it, and then returning it. So you could imagine if you had a Cold Fusion database-driven site, I could use Node.js, talk to SQL Server, get that data, return it, and then just work with it like it's flat, simple data. Very powerful. I'm just kind of scratching the surface of this. It's more powerful though when you start using it with pagination. Obviously, this lets you paginate data. Eleventy makes it really easy. It provides utilities for things like, hey, I have a lot of data and I want to paginate it by 10. I want to know what page I'm on. I want to know if I have more or less. Help me make links. This gets really complex, but we're going to keep a simple example of this. And it also solves an interesting problem, the virtual page problem, which is a Jamstack issue where I have a set of data and I don't want to make a file for each one of them. I want to make essentially one file each. Eleventy's pagination, it's not just for, I have 500 blog posts and I want to make, one page of 10 for each. It can also say, I want to make one page per blog post and just write out all of those files. So as an example, and again, I'm going to run it and then show you the code. Oh, I mentioned I would talk about why that went so slow. It went slow because the API I was using for Star Wars films took about 23 seconds. So that slowed me down. But what's cool is that only ran one time. I got my data and it was good. So I'm running Paginate again. This particular demo also makes use of the same API. So we'll probably have to wait 22 seconds, but I got 8 minutes until the end of my session or so that should be plenty of time. All right, it is up. Let me go back and kind of show. All right, so I have my list of cats. I have my list of films. I'm gonna show two things. I built a pagination for cats where I show 5 cats. I click next for more. I click next for more. And again, this is a fairly typical pagination example. The code behind this, and I know I'm going a little fast now, but this going to show you how easy it is. I built one template called cats.liquid. And in front matter, I basically said, hey, I want you to paginate over all my cats. And I added a lot more to my JSON file to make it bigger. I want you to use a size of 5 and create an alias for my data called cats. I can then just do for cat and cats. This represents one page, and Eleventy gives me links. So if I have a previous, then I could just link right back to it. If I have a next, I can go to it. For my films, go back home. I have one page per each. We'll go to Empire Strikes Back, the best. This is an example of pagination where I do one file per movie. And that also uses pagination, but the only difference is size of 1. And I told Eleventy that I want to use this particular permalink, or this link for each file. So again, I know I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'm going a little fast, but I love how easy Eleventy makes that. Real quickly, I'll talk a bit more about configuration. The CLI allows you to modify things, but in code, Eleventy will look for an eleventy.js file that allows you to programmatically configure things and pretty much everything. You can add new filters and shortcodes. I haven't talked about those yet. I'll show you an example. You can add global data, plugins, and more. It looks like this: module.exports equals function. It gets passed an Eleventy config object that allows you to do things like work with certain files or whatever. And I could return things that modify, like, for example, where to look for directories. As a real example of where you would use this, one of the behaviors of Eleventy that trips people up is that if it sees a file it doesn't know, doesn't recognize, it will ignore it. If you have a CSS file, it's going to ignore it because it doesn't process it. It just doesn't do it. So you have to tell Eleventy, hey, I want you to look for, these files, these folder, and I want you to pass through copy. Basically, copy them to my output. You almost always run into this with images, CSS, and JavaScript. And you see an example on screen there. You can, of course, use different values. If you have a styles folder instead, then you would use that. So that's another example. I'm going to skip the watch target. You can also add filters. Essentially, Eleventy.js is where you can add some custom code to your Eleventy site. All right, and I've been told to summarize, so I'm going to kind of quickly go over this a little bit. But things that you could do in configuration, you could tell Eleventy to ignore files. For example, in my development server, that's where I tell Eleventy to ignore, the first 15 years of my blog, so it can kind of run a bit quicker. You can specify directory options, filters and shortcodes, custom collections. Again, my blog makes use of that. Plugins, global data, and any particular options that you want to configure for Liquid, Handlebars, and more. And events. And there's a lot of docs on this. So plugins are a way to add a particular feature to Eleventy. There's some for RSS, image handling, serverless, even one for Adobe PDF that I built. It basically looks like this. You npm install it, and then you require it in your Eleventy.js, and then you add it. And if you want to add it with options, that's the example you see right here. And for more information, I did finish on time, barely, but I did finish on time. So there are docs, and I will just click just so you can see what they look like. Again, I would say watch out for the 1.0 flags if you don't want to use 1.0 yet. I have a couple posts on Eleventy on my blog if you want to just see examples. And typically, I would say start at the bottom because you could say, hey, why I'm digging Eleventy. And then I start playing with it, and I kind of went crazy 58 posts later. My blog has its own repository, so you can see how I built my site. There's a Slack org for Jamstack in general. It's a good place to discuss Eleventy. Eleventy has its own blog. And last but not least, if you want to learn about Eleventy and the Jamstack as a whole, Brian Rinaldi and myself, we have a book called The Jamstack Book. You can buy it now in what's called Meep Access. It's like a beta version of a book, but all the chapters are done. And when you buy the Meep version, you get the real version. So I would say it's safe to buy now. You may see some formatting and typo issues, but the book is really close to being released. You could pick that up and learn more about everything I talked about today. Sweet. So I finished with 3 minutes. I'm going to look at these questions I got passed in and try to do my best as possible. Nolan, hey Nolan. The thing that kept me away from SSGs is types all the content updates to my personal laptop. If my office manager or client wants it to decide directly, they have to install the local dependencies. Yes, so Nolan, we're talking about using a content management system. The good news, there are multiple CMS solutions that work with the Jamstack. So your non-technical users can make use of the Jamstack and not have to worry about learning JavaScript and Markdown and all that. The Jamstack book that Brian and I worked on talks about CMS examples and can show you real-world examples of that. All right, I see wrap up. I'm gonna try to do David's in my, oh, I already answered David's, sorry. Okay, I'm being told to wrap up. Brandon, I may get kicked off in 60 seconds, so I'm gonna try to read your question. Uh, oh, you're saying thank you. Well, that's easy. You're welcome. Thank you, Brandon Moore and Dobia. And thank you to everyone who attended. I appreciate your attention. Please reach out if you have more questions. Be safe. Have happy holidays. I love you all. Be good to each other and so forth. I think I finished just in time.